Hello, thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. I wish I were there in South Africa. I was last there 5 years ago, and I think it is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. Today, I'm going to talk with you about biodiversity offsetting and the law, and uh, title of the talk, Biodiversity Offsetting, Making Life Fungible. You have there some experts on the South African context. I'm going to talk to you about some overview on biodiversity offsetting and the law. Many of you know that biodiversity is in trouble. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services last year came up with the figures that there's been over 32 million hectares of primary forest lost in a 5-year period alone between 2010 and 2015. A quarter of the species that they have assessed face extinction. The global biomass of wild mammals decreased by 82% since 1970. And the major factor, which affects South Africa as it is everywhere else in the world, is the land use change, especially urban expansion and agriculture. Direct exploitation, hunting, etc., is also a threat, as are pollution and invasive species and the overarching threat of climate change, which threatens to exacerbate species loss going forward. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which has maintains the world's most respected list of endangered species, the red list, upon which your national biodiversity assessment is somewhat based, finds that 27% of all assessed species, more than 28,000, are threatened. Some taxa, like amphibians, more threatened than others. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a major report last year on climate change and land, and finds that people use 1/3 to 1/4 of the total net primary productivity, leaving very little or not enough for the rest of the creatures with which we share the planet. In South Africa, your last national biodiversity assessment that just came out last year throws that 14% of the species that they've looked at are threatened with extinction. That's 3,157 species. And especially given South Africa's unique endemic fauna and especially flora, 20% of all the endemics that you harbor are threatened with extinction. So, this from the National Biodiversity Assessment shows the number of ecosystem types that are also vulnerable or endangered or critically endangered. Riverine and wetland ecosystems particularly threatened, but terrestrial ecosystems, over 100 of the 450 or so ecosystem types that you've cataloged, are also vulnerable or endangered or critically endangered. The Aichi targets are under the Center of the Convention on Biological Diversity. They are aiming for about 17% of land to be put aside in conservation trust by 2020. As you can see by the line, these are the lines of South Africa's progress. You are below that. The solid line is sheer hectares of land that's put aside, and the dotted line are hectares of particular ecosystem types, particularly distinctive ecosystems. At any rate, South Africa is below the 17% Aichi target. At the same time, we are now at 7.7 billion people. It's expected to go up 2 billion by 2050, and perhaps 11 billion by 2100. South Africa's population is growing quite rapidly as well, further threatening biodiversity. So what is biodiversity offsetting? So in biodiversity offsetting, a jurisdiction, a nation, a state, a region will allow developers to degrade a particular legally protected ecosystem or species in exchange for an offset elsewhere. And this is in the process of either being implemented or actively implemented or in planning stages in over 50 nations, including South Africa. To quote from the World Bank's take on biodiversity offsetting, some of the core features are a mitigation hierarchy that when you're developing, you should first avoid destroying particular ecosystems or species. Where you can't avoid, you should minimize the damage. Where you can't minimize the damage, you should mitigate on site. And when you can't mitigate on site, you should offset to make sure that the externalities of that development are compensated for in some way. The offsets should be measurable, preferably with at least no net loss, but a net gain of the protected biodiversity, whether it's species or ecosystem, with like for like or better. That is to say, either you're replacing the species or ecosystems with the same thing, or with something that is more critically endangered or rarer. And there should be a lot of experts, biological and others, that are involved in the comprehensive planning for biodiversity offsetting. Where does this come from? There is a long history, especially in the United States, back into the 1970s, of wetlands compensatory mitigation. That is to say, the idea is that the ecosystem function provided wetlands over here, if destroyed, can be compensated for by preserving wetlands over here, there. In the 1990s in the United States, this transformed, the idea then transformed into pollution trading in the United States, particularly sulfur dioxide, where factories were allowed to offset their pollution by saving sulfur dioxide emissions somewhere else. If it worked for one pollutant in one particular place, then maybe it can work for greenhouse gases around the globe. And we now have a multi-billion-dollar global system of carbon trading. And that led us to think about reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, that entities can offset their own industrial pollution by investing in trees and other flora, because trees absorb carbon dioxide and water and produce sugar for themselves and oxygen for the rest of us. And this is a way of simultaneously reducing greenhouse gases, transferring wealth from global north to global south, and perhaps preserving biodiversity at the same time. Biodiversity offsetting is controversial. Here's a quote from a professor at the University of Western Australia. To me, it is akin to some guy going to that art gallery and pointing at the Mona Lisa on the wall and saying, sorry, mate, we need that bit, so the Mona Lisa has to go, but we'll paint you another one. If you are against biodiversity offsetting, you think that individual life forms are not fungible, that ecosystems should not be replaced, and at any rate, ecosystems cannot be replaced, that we have existing laws that protect ecosystems or species for a reason. Why undercut them? That this is all a license to trash nature. Furthermore, there are people that think it is capitalism that is destroying biodiversity right now, so we should not further reify the capitalist system by making biodiversity just another tradable commodity. So why might we do it? Well, we are in the twin crises of biodiversity depletion and climate change, and maybe we should never waste a good crisis. The tools that we have been using do not seem to be effective in staunching the loss of biodiversity. And if we can't end capitalism, perhaps we can hijack it so that developers and polluters will pay for the externalities of their biodiversity destruction in a way that they have not up until now. If you do it right, it can reduce the red tape of compliance, sometimes by having specialists do the biodiversity mitigation that you, if you are a developer, don't want to do yourself. And finally, one of the problems with biodiversity conservation is that it's expensive, and this is a funding stream potentially for biodiversity conservation. And it actually could work if it's planned, if it's part of a comprehensive planned system of land use mapping, where a jurisdiction figures out where is development going to happen, where is conservation going to happen. In order to do that, we have to be clear about what we value and how much we value. And we have to specify in the law who needs to do what, where, and when. What do we mean? So in South Africa, you have mapped out 458 distinctive ecosystem types, And so you have the possibility of what a director of SANBI has called a managed drawdown. You're not going to protect every square hectare of all 458 distinct ecosystem types, but perhaps you could carefully plan for a rational system where you are using offsetting and other conservation tools to preserve functioning ecosystems of each of those types, and therefore accommodate both necessary economic development and biodiversity. 4 different variables the law has to think about when doing careful biodiversity offsetting. The first is space. You have to specify how far from the original source of destruction must the offset be, or may the offset be? In other words, what's the service area? Does it have to, if there's destruction in KwaZulu-Natal, is the service area KwaZulu-Natal? Or is it being constrained by ecological parameters, which sometimes don't respect state or national borders? Is it about what local communities actually want? So you have to figure out where the offsetting can occur and where the offset should be placed. You also have to figure out if there are particular priority spaces, for example, connectivity corridors, so that species can migrate in a climate change era, that to which offsetting could be prioritized as a way of building the conservation estate. In South Africa in particular, given Section 27 of your Constitution's right to safe, clean drinking water, you could be prioritizing the headwaters of particular water sources, because the only way you're going to grow more water to serve the human rights owed by the Constitution to an ever-growing population is by protecting the ecological infrastructure that preserves and creates water for people. In addition to space, we have to think about time. That is to say, do offsets have to be secured before the destruction is allowed? Destruction is permanent. The offset might not actually be. So do you need a plan? Do you need a contract with an offset provider? Or, as I will describe in California, do offsets have to be prepared and stable before the destruction is allowed? So how guaranteed does the offset have to be before you allow the guaranteed destruction? And then once you've allowed an offset, how long do you have to maintain them? If it's a mining project that goes 20 years, do you only have to maintain the offset for 20 years? Do you have to maintain the offset in perpetuity, make some guarantee that the offset is going to be sustained, perhaps with suitable financial arrangements? In addition to space and time, you have to think about type. What's the unit of offset that you're trading? Is it species for species? Is it habitat or ecosystem type? How do you measure that? Do you measure it in hectares, or can you measure it in management gains? Like, for example, improved management of a particular area to sustain the species or ecosystem at risk. Do you always have to do like for like, or sometimes are you allowed to trade up? For example, some of your ecosystem types that are destroyed might be vulnerable. Can you trade for an area of critically endangered ecosystems, and thus you are trading up in terms of conservation value? Finally, any offset law has to specify, are there red flags that you never can offset because you can never destroy this particular species or ecosystem? And finally, given that destruction is permanent and that sometimes species don't always read the contract, do you need some kind of ratio to try to guarantee that you're going to have net gain? Is that, for example, in hectares? And do you actually need a metric that somehow accounts for area, ecological importance, and the quality of the habitat that is being provided in the offset? So you need some kind of a metric that determines what you're going to trade for what and how you calculate that. Finally, in addition to space, time, and type, you need to think about personnel. Who has to do what? Who's required to purchase an offset? Who may provide an offset? Is it the government, where a developer might pay into a fund and then the government can channel that money towards desired conservation outcomes? Do the developers themselves make their own offsets? Or do you allow, as for example in Australia or the UK or the United States, private brokers who specialize in biodiversity offsetting? Finally, to make sure that the offset is working, you need someone to measure the results, to monitor progress, to report to some government agency that the offset is or is not working, and to verify that the reports are accurate. Who in a democracy gets to weigh in about whether or not the offset should be permitted? A little bit on global notes. If you're looking for examples, Australia has been the world leader, for better or worse, on biodiversity offsetting. That is to say, just about all of the states have some kind of biodiversity offset program and have been for a couple of decades now, with some successes and some failures, and each state does it in a different way. So there's some really interesting examples there. The UK had a national plan a number of years ago. It didn't go anywhere, and now they are trying to resuscitate the plan because they want to build housing. And there is what is called the DEFRA metric. DEFRA is the Department of Environmental, Food, and Rural Affairs, that is using a metric of habitat distinctiveness, condition, and areas in hectares to try to do some kind of rational calculation of how they can have housing and biodiversity as well. Again, you have in the audience there people who know a lot more about South Africa context than I do. Western Cape and KwaZulu-Natal have long had draft policies. There has been a national policy in the works for years. It is not official policy. And from what I understand, the actual requirement to offset is quite ad hoc. It's not always clear whether it's required. Not every minister responsible for making these decisions will require an offsetting in every situation. It's not clear what circumstances require them and who's supposed to be monitoring. And obviously in South Africa, there is sometimes a lack of economic capacity, sometimes a lack of administrative capacity, and sometimes you have other things to worry about in South Africa, and biodiversity offsetting might not always be at the top of everyone's policy agenda. Here is the United States system. We don't have a national biodiversity offsetting policy. At the end of the administration of President Barack Obama, he and his people had put forth a comprehensive framework to try to make rational sense and make a national policy. There was actually a proposed rule, and the focus was on not on ad hoc, occasionally here, occasionally there projects, but to try to use offsetting and other kinds of mitigation as in a comprehensive landscape scale planned way. One of the poster species for this was a cooperative agreement between national, state, local governments and the ranchers, frackers, and oil explorers in the Rocky Mountain region where the greater sage-grouse was threatened. This is a male sage-grouse. They perform on leks for females who gather around and decide which male sage-grouse they like best. Unfortunately, the sage-grouse have chosen to live primarily in Republican congressional districts. So to try to stop all hell from breaking loose, if the sage-grouse was to be listed under our endangered species list, there was a comprehensive biodiversity offset program put together, and then something very odd happened. And then our new Secretary of the Interior, Ryan Zinke, called compensatory mitigation and biodiversity offsetting un-American, extortionate, and unlawful. So currently we have no national plan. California has a fairly robust system of biodiversity offsetting. We are the 5th largest economy here in the People's Republic of California. And there are a number of private biodiversity brokers who will perform biodiversity offsetting for developers. I'm showing you the screenshot of Wildlands, which operates in the central part of our state. Sacramento, our state capital, is a boom town, growing exponentially, unfortunately threatening many different endangered species. So there are various different projects that Wildland has started. They call this the Sacramento River Ranch. In addition to growing hay and corn and alfalfa, they grow endangered species and sell the offsets to developers. This is part of one piece of their land. This is salmon habitat that did not exist 20 years ago. They've done all of this restoration. I'll give you one example of the Valley Elderberry Longhorn beetle, or the VELB, one of the 14 beetles listed on the United States Endangered Species List. You are a developer and you need to provide a VELB offset. Well, you can go to a website and see who's selling you offsets. These are elderberry bushes where the VELBs spend their entire life. And this is all land that Wildlands has restored. This is VELB heaven. And so what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service comes in, decides that you can get for every acre, I have not done the translation into hectares, you can get nearly 22.5 credits. That's what a credit is. And the Wildlands can sell those credits to developers for between $3,000 and $4,000 per credit. There are certain ratios where the developer has to multiply the amount of hectares they're destroying in terms of what they buy from Wildlands. And it all has to happen in a particular government service area. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service requires that the conservation easement is permanent, that there's a financial mechanism that goes with a monitoring plan, and that it has to fit in the larger conservation strategy plan for the species. And all of this has to be done in advance. That is to say, this is risky for the biodiversity farmer. They have to set up these offsets in advance before Fish and Wildlife Service will grant them to right to sell their credits. So that's one system in California. Some concluding thoughts. When we talk about the mitigation hierarchy, biodiversity offsetting is always on the lowest rung. If it is something that could work in South Africa and could be a way to channel conservation funding for developers to pay for the externalities they otherwise would not be paying for, perhaps it need not be at the bottom of that hierarchy. Perhaps it could be baked in to government conservation planning. But it is expensive to make sure that the system is set up correctly, that the landscape has been restored or has been perpetually protected, is often quite expensive. This isn't just a cheap way out to allow developers to do what they want. There is always the problem that if you are offsetting biodiversity, that leaves people who live in the places where the destruction actually happened in a green desert where they lack access to biodiversity. Finally, when we try to put metrics on things, it's not always clear that biodiversity can be calculated. As George Monbiot, who's one of the main critics of biodiversity offsetting, puts it, these figures, ladies and gentlemen, are marmalade. They are finely shredded, boiled to a pulp, heavily sweetened, and still indigestible. In other words, they are total gibberish. But you can't do it without metrics because developers and government agents have to know exactly what's required so that it's fair to everyone. And you need scientists to be playing some kind of a role to make guesstimates of what a species or ecosystem needs to survive. But when we make ratios or multipliers, we're really about predicting the unpredictable. The species don't always read the contract. The ecosystem doesn't always read the offset protocol. At the end of the day, it's all about what we value and how much we value it. It's hubris to think we can rearrange nature, but at the same time, we're doing it anyway, so perhaps we should be more careful in our planning. And if we don't do offsetting, putting a fence around things and telling people you must preserve biodiversity is only going to get you so far. And whether it's in a developed nation like the United States or a rapidly developing nation like South Africa, someone has to pay for biodiversity preservation. Are you going to stop development and resource extraction? Or is this a way to at least get resource extractors and developers to pay for the externalities of their development? Your cities are going to continue to grow. They're not simply going to do infill. You're going to make steel, you're going to have cows, and someone has to pay taxes so that you have schools and roads and healthcare. So you're not going to be able to stop development. On the other hand, is biodiversity offsetting a pressure valve that allows development to happen where it otherwise wouldn't? And by making elephants or tortoises or finbus commodities, are we merely sustaining and reinforcing capitalism that's destroying the planet whole in the first place? At some point, we need a fundamental change of values and a paradigm shift where we recognize the fact that human civilization fundamentally depends upon functioning ecosystems. So perhaps biodiversity offsetting is a stopgap while waiting for that paradigm shift to happen, as opposed to an end to itself. Maybe South Africa is the right place to try this. You've got comprehensive species and ecosystem surveys. You don't have funding to protect the species and ecosystems you want to protect. You could be using this as a model to synergize providing the human right to safe, clean drinking water with preserving the critical ecological infrastructure and using offsetting as your funding stream. And because so much of your economy, at least pre-COVID, depends upon tourism, you are also synergizing your tourist value by preserving these ecosystems and species. I am neither a proponent nor an opponent of offsetting. I find it fascinating, and I hope that you do too. I would be happy now to take questions. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for listening.